Good afternoon. It's Wednesday, the 19th of November, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. My co-host today is Charles Malcolm. Charles Malet. Welcome to the program, Charles.
Thank you, Mike.
Tripping over my own words. And joining us live via live link, we have Vanessa Beeley. Now, later in the program, we'll be looking at the ongoing implications of the police and crime bill. And we're looking at MBS, his visit to Trump in Washington, the developing Chinese spy allegations here in the UK, and more on the situation of farmers here as well. But we're going to begin today with hate crime because the Starmer regime has launched a review into public order and hate crime as a result of the so-called terrorist attack in Manchester on the 2nd of October this year. The regime says that, and you better hold on to your hats, everyone, because this just might make you lose your lunches. They say the government will always protect the right to lawful protest and free speech, but will not tolerate individuals or groups who intimidate others, incite hatred, or create disorder. So I suppose that fairly massive caveat, and the second part of that gives a lie to their protection of free speech and lawful protest is why we've seen the Police Crime Courts and Sentencing Act, the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Criminal Conduct Act, the Online Safety Act, the Public Order Act, and the upcoming Police and Crime Bill, to name but 5 pieces of recent legislation from successive governments. Now, let's not mention what they were willing to do in the so-called emergency with the Coronavirus Act as well. So the regime goes on to say that the review will therefore look at the powers of will look at the powers police have to manage protests and the current hate crime laws, including offences for aggravated behaviour and stirring up hatred. It will examine whether existing legislation is effective and proportionate and whether it protects communities from hate and intimidation. It will also consider if the law protects free speech and peaceful protest while also preventing disorder and keeping people safe. Shabana Mahmood, the Home Secretary, said the terrorist attack in Manchester on the 2nd of October shocked the nation. Well, I'm going to suggest it didn't shock the nation in the sense she means anyway. What shocked the nation is how the regime has turned an admittedly unpleasant but relatively minor and completely police mishandled issue into a major terrorist event. Is that an unfair statement?
No, I must say, I think that's totally fair. Absolutely.
Okay. Well, she went on to say, lawful protest and free speech are fundamental rights, but we cannot allow them to be abused and to spread hate or cause disorder. The law must be fit for purpose and consistently applied. And I wonder what she means by consistently applied. Does she mean in all circumstances, or does she mean consistently applied for the protection of one particular group or demographic? Well, maybe we can answer that if we look at who's going to lead the review, because it's this man, Lord MacDonald of Riverglaven, KC. This is Ken MacDonald. He has practiced as a barrister since 1978. In 2003, he was elected chairman of the Criminal Bar Association. And later that year, he was appointed Director of Public Prosecutions for England and Wales. And it was in that role that he was responsible for the prosecution and subsequent dropping of the case of Catherine Gunn. Now, in 2007, he was knighted for services to the law. And in 2010, he was appointed to the House of Lords, where he sits as a crossbencher. Currently, he practices for Matrix Chambers. That's the same Matrix Chambers founded by Cherie Blair. So if we just put him back on screen again, I'll just zoom out a little bit to show that he is also part of the all-party UK-Israel parliamentary group. Not that there could be any coincidence there. Now, he's going to be supported in this role by this person, Owen Wetherill. He's a senior policing expert who brings operational experience, it says on this page here, from his role as National Police Chiefs Council lead for civil contingencies and national mobilisation. Because, of course, the Civil Contingencies Act also puts massive restrictions on protest and freedom of speech under certain circumstances, Charles, just to name yet another piece of legislation. Sorry, that quote there was from the government press release. He left that role in September 2023, and he currently works for this organisation, Investogo Government Solutions, who are pretty vague about what they do. But anyway, alongside this role for that organisation, he serves as Associate Chief Officer of the College of Policing. He serves the National Police Chiefs Council lead for UK for the UK COVID Public Inquiry, and he's a commissioner for the National Preparedness Commission. So that's who's going to be running this review. And it's pretty clear what the focus of the review is. It's being kicked off because of the events in Manchester on the 2nd of October. And clearly, it's going to be about restricting criticism of Israel.
Absolutely, without a doubt. And it just highlights the way in which so much legislation goes now, particularly that pertains to any sort of criminal activities. It's almost entirely subjective, and it removes the element of intent. So it is for the supposed victim to interpret the action in whichever way they see fit, or indeed to whichever way in which the agenda wants to appropriate it, or should I say misappropriate it. I think the other thing to bring out, particularly with the data concerned, is to go back to the Cameron government, which I reported on fairly recently, and the way in which the Community Security Trust holds the data for hate crime, because they wrote the document and entered into a data sharing agreement with the Home Office back in, I think it was 2011. So the pedigree and the direction of travel with specific regard to this issue, it means that the entire thing is compromised from the outset.
Vanessa, I'd be interested in getting a bit of comment from you on this, because, obviously we have the situation with ongoing trials now over Palestine action, but just as I read the list of legislation, each of which has its own restrictions on the ability to protest and the ability to make comment on current events. This is a pretty. What do we say about the United Kingdom at the moment? It is impossible, or it's increasingly impossible, to actually push back against policies that we disagree with.
Well, it's interesting you say that, but a number of the cases that have gone forward have actually either been dismissed, or the person defending themselves on the basis of free speech, particularly when it comes to criticism of Israel, have been set free without charges, basically. And so therefore, I think to a degree what that tells us is the only way to go up against it is through lawfare, because at the moment that is being extremely successful. And of course, Professor David Miller being the flag bearer from that perspective, of course.
You any thoughts on that?
Well, not specifically on that, but just before the moment passes, just to remind people that the interview that Catherine Gunn did with UK Column is called A Defence of Necessity, and particularly with regard to Ken MacDonald's part in what you're talking about, it's absolutely a must listen. So please do go to the website to have a look at that.
Well, okay, then of course I did mention the police and crime bill there a couple of times. So what's the latest on that then?
Well, the latest is the sort of, I suppose, in a way, moving in from an oblique angle. And we'll just take a look at what the BBC has been reporting on recently. This is actually going back to February. Electronic devices used for car theft set to be banned. Now, this is against a backdrop of around 700,000 vehicle-related thefts in 2024. And the critical detail here is that approximately 60% of them, and that comes from the Metropolitan Police Service, are via electronic means. So we've now got the BBC reporting this month that keyless car theft devices used by criminals are being sold for up to £20,000 a pop. Now, what this relates to, as Mike has alluded to, is the Crime and Policing Bill. And throughout the course of this year, since February when it was first announced, there have been several fact sheets put out, and the BBC obviously is rehashing this as though it is new news. It absolutely isn't. But we'll just dip into the serious crime fact sheet, which was last updated in July of this year, and I quote directly from it: "The bill introduces 2 new offences to criminalise the possession, importation, making, adapting, supplying, or offering to supply an electronic device, such as a signal jammer, for use in theft of a vehicle or theft of anything in a vehicle." So what this is referring to is an electronic means of interfering with a vehicle and being able to unlock or indeed steal it by a remote mechanism that deals with the car key itself and gets to trick the car into thinking that the person using the device has ownership of the key itself. So the significance here is that this is a move away from the way in which the police are able to deal with such incidents at the moment. And the fact sheet also says these devices are not in themselves currently illegal to possess. Offenders can be charged with going equipped to commit theft under Section 25 of the Theft Act 1968, conspiracy to steal or conspiracy to handle stolen goods. But the offender's motivation needs to be proved. Now, it goes back to the point I was literally just making, which is about the subjectivity or indeed the element of intent in the commission of a criminal offence. Now, in the same moment, the government put out another fact sheet concerning the police powers that would come with the Crime and Policing Bill. And it's just interesting, on a related note, to point to the fact that they're also talking about giving police power to access information held in online accounts. And they're saying the reason for this is that it is increasingly important to be able to investigate crime and protect national security. And we're going to come back to this. The changes will make sure that law enforcement agencies can access vital evidence and intelligence. And of course, to allay concerns, they say that there are safeguards and statutory practices in place. But if anyone can point to an example where things of exactly that ilk haven't been ritually and routinely abused, then I would be very surprised. Now, this also is, again, something to bear in mind for later. But the point to draw out here is that what this does is, it appears at least, to turn on its head the presumption of innocence. And this is set out, it obviously exists long established in common law, but it's set out specifically in the Human Rights Act of 1998 under Article 6, which says everyone charged with a criminal offence shall be presumed innocent until proved guilty according to law. So as far as police and indeed the remainder of the judiciary might be concerned, this obviously makes it inconvenient if they have to prove that somebody carrying such a device is actually intent on stealing a car or stealing from a car with it. So what's the answer? Well, you just change the law, and therefore you deflect the necessity to provide that burden of proof. And in doing so, this is where we come back to the failure to adhere to the presumption of innocence, because, to quote from the bill itself, there are very few legitimate uses for these devices, which is why we are taking steps to criminalise their possession. Those who do have a valid use for such a device should have no difficulty in demonstrating that. So it's a complete inversion of the current situation. Basically, if you're found anywhere near one of these devices, it is up to you to be able to prove that you had absolutely no intent to conduct any criminal activity with it, which is very, very significant in its own right, but also pertaining to the rest of the bill. Now, the other thing I've talked about quite a bit before are respect orders, which again are a means within this bill to be able to place an order on somebody, even if they're suspected of doing something that's not a criminal activity, which is to conduct antisocial behaviour. And a subsequent order can be put upon them, which either mandates or prohibits certain activities, or for them to be in a different place, or whatever it is. And by breaching that order, they will then enter into criminal territory. So the whole sort of tenor of this bill is really a significant departure of the way in which law really should be written and indeed put into statute. Now, as I say, in order to have an offence commissioned under this particular piece of legislation, you literally just have to be in the same place as such a device. And of course, it's one rule for us and indeed another for the state. Mike's already referred to the Covert Human Intelligence Sources Act 2021, and no issue to use such devices there if you're working for the state, because of course that was an act to make provision for and in connection with the authorization of criminal conduct in the course of or otherwise in connection with the conduct of covert human intelligence sources. And just to extend the theme of the state being able to do what on earth it likes when it likes, I refer back to His Majesty's Government Communications Centre, which a year or so ago announced a competition to produce a gizmo that was going to be able to capture information off people's electronic SIM cards. And they're now putting out a challenge to create realistic prosthetic facial masks for training exercises, or at least so they say. Now, of course, the purpose of that is to be able to defeat artificial intelligence and live facial recognition. But that is specifically something that the remainder of the population is prohibited from doing, which is really quite extraordinary when one thinks about the background to all of this. Now, to go back to the car theft and what this points towards, we go back a number of years to the International Journal of Critical Infrastructure Protection and their theory on how this technology could actually be used to interfere with many other things that are held on mobile telephones. And in particular, we're really considering here attacks on what might be described as digital wallets. And the technology here we're talking about is a near-field communication, or an NFC relay attack. And again, Kaspersky Daily going into specific references here with regard to Apple Pay and Google Wallet, essentially saying that the attackers, in the previous part, they say that the attackers would start devising new cheats, for instance, relay attacks against phone applications. Of course, this has now come to pass, and Kaspersky saying that in late 2024, fraudsters came up with another NFC relay scheme in Russia, and victims weren't even asked for their card credentials. Basically, they were convinced to install an app on their telephone purporting to be government or banking or another important service. And this has especially taken effect since Russians have been deprived of access to certain things due to sanctions. So people have agreed to install such apps. And then the victim is prompted to hold their card to their smartphone and enter their PIN. And of course, that essentially highlights the incredible vulnerability of all of these sorts of technologies, which it's being insisted by the state we are able to use securely and, of course, conveniently. And by coincidence, yesterday, the Home Affairs Committee hosted oral evidence on harnessing the potential of new digital forms of identification. And one of those contributing was Laura Foster, the Associate Director of Tech UK. And just to point to the direction that Tech UK is coming from, they, in an article entitled Digital ID 2030, Building a Digital UK Based on a Digital Government Backbone, they say that a decentralized ID model, one where multiple trusted actors from both government and the private sector work together, is the best fit for the UK's specific environment. So again, leaping the obstacle of whether or not there's actually a problem that needs to be solved, the insistence that there are indeed trusted entities on both sides of the fence points very strongly towards all of this legislation really being used as a smokescreen and to divert away from the inherent vulnerability of the new technology that's being put in front of us. And just to, before I ask for some comment, which I know that Mike will have, I'll just point to an example that has been sent in by a UK column viewer, Jules, which comes from an MOD vehicle, or at least a vehicle leased to the MOD, and it just highlights exactly the problem that we're in. So there are two signs, if you're listening and not watching, two signs on the dashboard of the vehicle. The first of which says MOD devices are not to be connected to the vehicle. And then the next one says avoid conversations above official within the vehicle. I mean, is there really any better way to illustrate the absurdity of the situation that the government's trying to push us into?
Yeah. I mean, so they're leasing vehicles they have no control of, and they're so worried about snooping and the digital capabilities of these vehicles that they've got to put warnings in them to stop people talking. It's quite incredible.
It is absolutely incredible. But I mean, whilst a lot of this is laughable, actually, the way in which the entire country and indeed the legislative background is being sort of railroaded into this is incredibly unthinking. And one hopes that there are examples like the crime policing bill, which has overreach on so many levels, that people will actually wake up to the fact of that. And I think, specifically within Parliament, so if there is further debate to be had on this, which of course there is, that people do realise the unwarranted measures that are being set out in this bill.
Well, I would like to hope so, but I have to say I'm not optimistic about it, because when was the Chiz Act? 2017, 2018?
2016, I think.
2016.
Yeah.
So I mean, we're going back nearly 10 years now. And if that piece of legislation didn't waken up to what the government said. So every piece of legislation that we've talked about in the last 10 years, where we've said there's government overreach, it's an enabling act, secondary legislation is just waiting around the corner, it's a slippery slope. We've used all these kinds of words. and the message still not quite getting through yet.
Yeah,
so
true enough.
Anyway, okay. Well, look, let's move on then and bring Vanessa back onto the program. And Vanessa, let's start with the United Nations Security Council.
Yes, well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, sad news, really, in the sense that the UN Security Council has now adopted the US resolution on Trump's Gaza peace scam, as I call it. Now, of course, what this plan, we've covered the plan itself in previous news programs, but effectively what it does is to kick Palestinian statehood down the road while enforcing international occupation with Tony Blair involved. Effectively, it's a criminal project to further reduce the territory within Gaza that is under the control of the Palestinians. And of course, it relies upon the disarmament of the resistance factions, including Hamas. The resistance military factions have put out a very strong statement saying that they reject the plan entirely. But the furor, particularly on social media, has been over the abstention by Russia and China. And of course, this is reminiscent, as many analysts pointed out, of their abstention back in 2011 over the Libya no-fly zone, which, of course, as we now know, didn't end very well for former President Muammar Gaddafi or for Libya itself, which has now plunged into terrorist vacuum with effectively all powerful nations involved in capturing Libyan resources and territory. So, first of all, I also want to point out what I consider to be a split in the statements being made on the diplomatic scene, particularly by Russian representatives. So this is from Vasilina Bensia after the abstention. The full statement will be in the show notes, but he does actually say it is reminiscent of colonial practices and the League of Nations British mandate for Palestine when the opinion of Palestinians themselves was not taken into account. And that's a very important point. Many people are arguing that Arab states and Palestinian authorities themselves also approved the plan, but we're talking about Mahmoud Abbas of the Palestinian Authority, who's known to be a stooge of the Zionist entity and is generally hated by the majority of Palestinians who support resistance against the increasing occupation and expansion, particularly of the settlers in the occupied territories. But then we have Kirill Dmitriev, who's, of course, the special envoy of Putin, educated in Stanford and Harvard, connected to Davos and the WEF. Very strange and really rather shadowy history to this guy who's been heavily promoting relations between Russia and the United States and pushing Trump's monarchist origins, which is another odd factor in his discourse on social media. But here, effectively, he posts a video with Trump basically thanking Russia and China for abstaining, which again is an odd position to take when one considers the statement from Vasilina Bensia. So what I want to do is look at the events that led to this abstention. I'm certainly not going to come up with any smoking gun evidence of what I'm looking at, but I just want to look at those events because I think it's important to take note of them. So first of all, of course, we had the visit from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia originally, of course, was created by the British alongside the UAE, effectively as an extension to the Zionist entity in the region. So Israel, effectively, this was reported in Axios, wants Trump to condition the F-35 sale to Saudi Arabia on Israel normalization. So we have the state of Israel effectively telling the US how they should do business with Saudi Arabia. That's number one. And secondly, I want to show this video between Trump and Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia. And this is another clue as to what was going on behind the UN Security Council resolution.
Today and tomorrow, we're going to announce that we are going to increase that $600 billion to almost $1 trillion of investment, real investment and real opportunity by details in many areas. And the agreement that we are signing today in many areas, in technology, in AI, in earth materials, magnet, etc., that will create a lot of investment opportunities.
So you are doing that now. You're saying to me now that the 600 billion will be 1 trillion.
Definitely, because what we are signing, it will facilitate that, and we
I like that
build
very
on
much.
Now, that's interesting when one looks at some of the commentary again on X. This is Dr. Russell McGregor, and he points out there is a reason that President Trump met MBS on the day that the Epstein files were proceeding through the House and Senate. And now, of course, unanimously, House and Senate have insisted on the release of the Epstein files. And it's now on Trump's desk for him to basically agree to that. So Zionists have threatened, according to McGregor, to tank the U.S. economy, if the Epstein files are released. And therefore, the 1 trillion from Saudi Arabia is extremely important to maintain stability in the U.S. economy. Just a theory that I think is worth considering. And then, of course, Saudi Arabia has been very keen on guarantees from the United States regarding the defense assistance that the US has traditionally provided to Saudi Arabia. And here, Trump elevates Saudi Arabia to a major non-NATO ally status. So perhaps they've now achieved that reassurance and those guarantees from the United States in return, possibly, for their vote at the UN. Then, interestingly enough, the Western elected regime in Syria foreign minister, Assad al-Shaibani, was recently in China. Now, up until now, China has actually basically not recognized the Syrian government. This comes after Jolani's visits to Moscow, to the White House, to the UK, to France, Turkey, Saudi Arabia. In other words, he's been making the rounds and having backroom meetings with Israel over the security in the south. And here we have Shaibani in China almost immediately after the visit to the UK and the US, talks on economic cooperation. So China gets a foothold back in Syria with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative and counterterrorism. To some degree, China then gets reassurances from Jolani's regime. Uyghur terrorists will be sent back to China rather than being allowed to circulate in the region, potentially pose a risk to China. So China benefits also just prior to the abstention. Then, very interestingly, on the 15th of November, Putin initiated a phone call with Netanyahu to discuss the Middle East, which included discussions on both Syria and Gaza. 2 days later, a Russian military delegation turns up in Damascus and is filmed touring the south of Syria. That comes immediately after the phone call between Netanyahu and Putin and just before Russia's abstention at the UN, allowing the Trump bill or resolution to go through. Now, perhaps more disturbingly, with the passing of this bill, effectively what has now happened, it's given a green light to Israel. This was last night here in Lebanon. It was a Palestinian or is a Palestinian refugee camp in the south in Sidon that was bombed by precision missiles from Israeli aircraft. Now, this was claimed by Israel to be a Hamas center in this refugee camp. The reality is very different. So the Israeli military spokesperson, Avichai Adre, claimed that the attack targeted a Hamas training compound, if we could just have this on the screen, where militants were preparing to carry out terrorist operations. In fact, it was a sports field within the refugee camp. 15 civilians were killed, many of them young teenagers who were playing football at the time, and there were dozens of injuries in the attack, all of them Palestinian refugees. At the same time, Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has said humanitarian considerations no longer apply to Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon, holding the government responsible for what he described as terrorist camps inside areas classified as refugee camps. He added that Israeli forces had been given orders to neutralize them. So now, with the passing of this resolution, Israel expands its attacks on Palestinians in diaspora.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. Thank you for that. Okay, let's move on then. UK Column does need financial support from all our viewers, listeners, and members. Members, of course, are already providing that, and we want to say a massive thank you to everyone that is. But if you do click on the link here on the front page of the website, you can find out if you're not supporting us that way, how you can, and we would absolutely appreciate that. We do need it. If you can't support us financially, please do share material you find on the UK Column website. Now, Jerem, tonight we'll be speaking to his guest on the link between Freud, Epstein, and paedophilia. That's 7 p.m. Carl Zah has got the second part of his discussions with hip-hop artists in China. Do watch that at 9 if you can. Tomorrow, Charles, at 1 p.m, you're back on the topic of farming.
Yeah, indeed. Speaking to Alan Hughes about his time with Farmers to Action and the upcoming protest and engagement with government. And he really sets out the case very, very clearly for the predicament that British farmers are in, and specifically what you can do about that. And I'll talk a bit more about him in the rest later on in the news.
Okay, and the presentation that Brian gave at the Hope Festival that went out at 1 p.m. yesterday is now on the UK Column website. Have a look at that if you haven't seen it yet. And just like to let you know that on the 29th of November, Mike Eden, Ben Rubin, and Sandy Adams will be speaking in Stroud. That's at the old convent in Beaches Green at Stroud. So get along to that if you possibly can. Okay. Oh, you've got a quick advertisement.
Yeah, luckily I just happen to have this with me in the studio. Of course, no reporter would go anywhere without it. And it's also, I found it terrifically useful for writing down the other things that I want to buy in the UK Column shop.
Oh, did you? Right.
Yeah. So now on sale, Christmas is coming. Need I say more?
Oh, okay. Well, a second ago, Vanessa was talking amongst the other stuff there about MBS visit to Washington to see Donald Trump. I've got another little clip from the press conference. So let's have a listen to this and then we can discuss it.
Your Royal Highness, the U.S. intelligence concluded that you orchestrated the brutal murder of a journalist. 9/11 families are furious that you are here in the Oval Office. Why should Americans trust you? And the same to you, Mr. President.
Now, who are you with?
I'm with ABC News, sir.
You're with who?
ABC News, sir.
Fake news, ABC fake news. As far as this gentleman is concerned, he's done a phenomenal job. You're mentioning somebody that was extremely controversial. A lot of people didn't like that gentleman that you're talking about. Whether you like him or didn't like him, things happen. But he knew nothing about it, and we can leave it at that. You don't have to embarrass our guest by asking a question like that.
So, Vanessa, I'm interested in your thoughts on this because it seems to me that it doesn't really matter what any of us thinks about Khashoggi, because that's who we're talking about here. It doesn't matter what we think about him or his journalism. What Trump has effectively done there is say that state-sanctioned murder is quite all right.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think Khashoggi was not only murdered, of course, his body was dismembered while he was still alive. So it was one of the most brutal and gruesome murders in a foreign country, in Istanbul. And the fact that Trump has accused of the genocide committed by another ally, Israel, and here is whitewashing MBS's role in the murder of Khashoggi is just, it's grotesque.
Yeah, I mean, have you got any thoughts?
Grotesque is exactly the right word, but we've just been talking about the Covert Human Intelligence Services Act and the ability to commit criminal acts effectively under the auspices of sort of doing stuff on the state's behalf. We had Lindsey Graham the other day talking about killing all the right people. I mean, the people have been desensitized to such an extraordinary degree that this almost seems normal.
So I think, we absolutely have to recognize who is leading all our countries at the moment. And we've got to be willing to hold them to account. And now, no matter what you think about ABC for that matter, and Trump may be right in suggesting that they represent fake news in many ways. That's not the point here. The point is that, first of all, he said that at that moment to discredit a journalist from attempting to hold a world leader to account. That is the role of journalism. We've got lots of criticism to make about mainstream journalism, but that is the role that they're supposed to hold. And suggest that by doing that, you're somehow embarrassing someone who's come to visit. This is it's disgraceful. But anyway, let's move on to the latest in Lebanon, Vanessa.
Yeah, I mean, it's also interesting because she mentioned 9/11 victims, so they were also dismissed by Trump's comment. Yes, so Lebanon, this is also an interesting development, very much connected to what's just happened in the UN. The US cancels Lebanon army chief's trip as frustration grows over the Hezbollah disarmament. This is Rodolphe Heikel, the head of the Lebanese armed forces that, of course, are sponsored by the US in order to not be able to defend Lebanon against Israel. And in fact, he made a statement which effectively blamed Israel for the ongoing more than 5,200 violations of the ceasefire that came into effect in November 2024. And of course, this set off a flurry of commentary on X. This is Lindsey Graham, the dreadful Lindsey Graham. It is clear that the Lebanese chief head of defense, because of a reference to Israel as the enemy and his weak, almost non-existent effort to disarm Hezbollah, is a giant setback for efforts to move Lebanon forward. This combination makes the Lebanese armed forces not a very good investment for America. I mean, just extraordinary language here. He was responded to by someone from the region who said the Lebanese army has never been an investment for the United States. Its support for the army, which isn't enough to arm a gang stealing candy, has always been a pretext to interfere in Lebanon's defense affairs. If you want to assess the United States investments, you can count the Lebanese children who were killed by American bombs, American planes, American cover, and Israeli hands. Very much a comment that reflects the opinion of the majority of people here in Lebanon. And then this was Tom Harb again, who reposted Lindsey Graham's post saying, "Thank you, Senator Lindsey Graham, for taking notice of the Lebanese army's behavior and the Lebanese government's unwillingness to take action against Hezbollah and to implement a UN SCR 1559, instead just blaming Israel. I mean, how dare they? You have made the right decision by cancelling the meeting with the head of the army, General Rudolf Heikel. Our tax money must provide a return on investment in Lebanon. Hopefully, the president will read Trump administration very well and replace the head of the army with someone willing to get the job done soon." So this is extraordinary. This is a direct threat against the head of the Lebanese forces. Sovereignty goes out of the window, of course, not that we ever expected it to be a consideration of the US or the UK at any point. But just to reinforce what Heikel actually said this morning, there was a terrorist Israel attack that struck a civilian vehicle in the town of Al-Tari Bint, Jebel district, South Lebanon this morning, causing multiple casualties, among them school children who were riding in a bus directly behind the targeted car. The attack once again highlights Israel's blatant disregard for the rights of children and for its utmost disrespect of any ceasefire agreement. So, I mean, just extraordinary events really here in this region.
Thanks, Vanessa. And well, we'll talk about much more about that in extra, I've no doubt. Okay, let's move on then to back to the UK. In fact, because we've all got to be very, very afraid because Chinese spies are here in Britain, as if that's a new thing. The BBC is leading the charge on all of this, of course. They say that China has financed tens of billions of pounds worth of investment in UK businesses and projects this century, some of which give it access to military-grade technology. And this is according to BBC Panorama. I mean, this is incredible. A few days after BBC Panorama has caused the departure of the head of BBC News and the MD of the BBC in total. But anyway, if we just bring that back on screen for a second, this is the same BBC Panorama, by the way, that is guilty of attempting to interfere with an election in a foreign country. The same Panorama that attempted to interfere with the US vote on whether to not to bomb Syria in 2013. Panorama has investigated how this led to cutting-edge technology and skills being transferred to China, and the UK was far too free in allowing access to strategically important industries. They were quoting a former head of GCHQ. They didn't say which former head. Now, they were given exclusive early access to data collected by this organization on screen at the moment, AID Data. This is a research group at the William and Mary University in the US state of Virginia. Now, that's the same William and Mary University which sends many alumni to their neighbors at Langley, if you know what I'm talking about here. As for AI Data itself, in collaboration with multilateral organizations, they say about themselves, the IMF, World Bank, US government agencies, US aid, State Department, private foundations, including the Gates Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, the Ford Foundation, McGovern Foundation, and foreign governments, including Germany, Denmark, the United Kingdom, amongst others. So there can't be any conflict of interest there at all. It must be absolutely objective and honest brokerage going on. I'm quite sure of data at the moment that they pass to the BBC, and the BBC is pushing this narrative. But anyway, going back to the BBC for a second, this particular article is a disgrace because it says that when MPs, members of the House of Lords and their staff were warned about the threat from Chinese spies, in one office in Westminster, a quick check began. Simon Wellband is a Conservative councillor and also works for the Conservative MP Neil O'Brien, who was sanctioned by China in 2021. Simon went into his LinkedIn messages, and there it was, a message from an account in the name of Shirley Shen, sent some weeks earlier. He hadn't responded to the unsolicited message and reported it to Parliament's security services, he was then advised to block the account. The note, according to the BBC here, comes across as pretty innocuous. He said the message wasn't written in very good English. It was a message to say there was a job opportunity and I was interested, and to get in touch if I was. I've worked around Parliament for about 10 years now, so I'm kind of used to this. But if you're more junior, you don't know what you're looking for. You might think it's it's genuine offer that's made that's made to you on LinkedIn. They might accept. And the BBC says that he added that he thought it was becoming more common for those working at Parliament to be targeted by China. So here we go. Because the name attached to the message on LinkedIn was Shen, then it's immediately Chinese. I mean, this is pathetic. How many messages do we all receive that are phishing for information about us in all kinds of names from all kinds of countries? This is criminal activity in the main, and there's zero evidence that this or any other case is state sanctioned or deep state operations in any way. The BBC terror campaign has been followed up with an alert issued by MI5 and an action plan from the British government. So that's all good stuff. The plan, they say, is going to see intelligence services deliver security briefings for political parties and issue new guidance to election candidates to help them recognize, resist, and report suspicious activity. They're going to help people work with professional networking sites to make sure to make them a more hostile operating environment for spies, and they're going to tighten rules on political donations through a new elections bill. Goodness knows what else that's going to cover. And wonderful, £170 million is going to be invested in renewing the sovereign encryption technology that civil servants use to safeguard sensitive work. While in the meantime, as Charles has already mentioned, they're passing out vehicles to the Ministry of Defence where they need to put labels on to make sure that that certain conversations aren't had within the vehicles in case they're being spied on. This is, I mean, I don't even know where to start with this. One of the real skills of the mainstream press over the last couple of decades has been to persuade us that something which is absolutely normal is somehow abnormal, that there's something different going on, that there's something we've got to be scared of. And the fact of the matter is that countries have been spying on each other not forever, right? So it's not that Chinese are suddenly spying on Britain. Britain is currently spying on China. Britain is spying on Russia. Britain is spying on Iran. Britain is spying on the United States. we are spying on each other and have been forever. There's nothing abnormal about this. And to suggest that a phishing email or a phishing message coming in on a social media platform is somehow evidence of a spy network that we've all suddenly got to be afraid of is just it's just off the charts nuttiness. And if we fall for it, we deserve everything that's coming.
I think it's great. It's almost like the foreign influence registration scheme doesn't work. The security minister was very clear. People who come into the country and are working for foreign government need to declare to the government. Of course, and they would do that. So we should know about all of this. That must be working, mustn't it? There's that. But then the suggestion, going back to the MOD vehicle, that somehow China might be able to listen into conversations in vehicles leased to the MOD, but letting Israel design absolutely every single component of all the military vehicles is absolutely fine. But the last bit that I found...
just before you get on to the last bit, but also the fact that Israel is basically running the core of the internet through Unit 8200 originated companies providing the backbone of the internet, and we're worried about Huawei. This it's just insane. Anyway.
But no, the final part was I'm not sure why in the Houses of Parliament something being written in not very good English meant that it was it's definitely going to be somebody from another country.
It's probably somebody from the next office.
Yes, exactly.
Anyway, yeah. Okay, let's move on to farming.
We will. Now, at the budget last year, there was a surprise and unmandated announcement about the changes to inheritance tax, specifically agricultural property relief and business property relief, which since 1992 had a 0% relief, effectively. Sorry, wrong, 100% relief, so that businesses and agricultural holdings were not subject to inheritance tax. The Chancellor, without any real warning, said that from April 2026, this would change and a threshold would be introduced at £1 million. Now, this meant that there were substantial protests a year ago, and with the budget approaching next week, there's been much chat about this, as one would expect, because of all the various knock-on effects. Now, Angela Eagle, who's the farm minister, was on Farming Today just this morning saying the Treasury is resistant to making any change to the position on the matter. And as I say, this was not in the Labour manifesto. There was no advance warning of it. And inheritance tax, in effect, if one does want to make another arrangement, does take 7 years to take full effect, even though there is a sort of tapering system between the start and the finish of that process. Now, over the past week, things have been gathering a bit of momentum, and just yesterday, farmers were up in London, as reported by Farmers Guardian on Twitter, saying that farmers aren't giving up. So there's been engagement with MPs, and there is a sort of a sense of, if not positivity, certainly optimism, that there are enough ministers and indeed MPs out there who are at least willing to talk. And the backdrop to this, in terms of reporting, at least in the mainstream, is that the Treasury has not been playing with a straight bat. And we see City AM here saying they've buried a farming report until after the budget in an inheritance tax blow. Now, what they're talking about here is the farming profitability review, terms of reference for which were published back in April 2025. But just before we go into the specifics of that, to clarify the position, when the government said that they were going to change the threshold on inheritance tax in order to recoup this amount of money, the then Minister, Daniel Zeichner, admitted that the money that was anticipated to be brought out from it was only £500 million, which is roughly equivalent to a day's spending for the NHS. The Treasurer also saying that it's only going to affect a quarter of those with land holdings, but the fact remains that no one seems to be entirely sure where they've got those figures. The reason all of this is relevant in terms of the delay of this report is that during the announcement of the profitability review, it said that the final report will be delivered within 6 months of appointing the farming profitability review lead. Well, 6 months has elapsed, and in that very document, it was announced that Minette Batters, the former president of the NFU, had been appointed to lead the review. So why, therefore, is the review to be delayed. There doesn't seem to be any strong reason for this. However, when we look further into it, Minette Batters turns out to be an outspoken critic of agricultural policy, but especially with regard to inheritance tax. She wrote in Country Life last year that there are serious questions to be asked as to whether the advice given to ministers is correct. And I quote, in this article, she wrote that ministers claim that 73% of farms will not be affected by the changes, yet they haven't explained how they got to that figure. I suspect it includes so-called lifestyle farms that don't produce significant amounts of food and comprise less than 40 acres. So essentially, she's trying to make a distinction here between farms that are run, in effect, for the good of the public insofar as food production is concerned. But of course, the issue being ignored here is that the government is doing its level best to stop people producing food by incentivising the de-risking of farming practices, by introducing environmental land management schemes that encourage people not to grow food, but instead to enter into periods, or at least tracts of land, of nature recovery to meet various targets that have come from outside of government, specifically the Terra Carta from the Sustainable Markets Initiative and indeed the United Nations, the 30 by 30 pledge. So I've been in touch with the Treasury to get clarification on this. Of course, they passed the buck to DEFRA, who wrote back to say that the Batters profitability review is an important step in our commitment to boosting the long-term profits of farmers and will be published before Christmas. They went on to refer to the farming roadmap, which they hope to publish before Christmas as well. So the inference there to be drawn, I think, is that the review will be highly critical of government agricultural policy as it is, and it seems highly unlikely that the Treasury hasn't indeed intervened to suppress this report coming out before the budget. Now, as Mike mentioned earlier, I've run an interview with Alan Hughes, who was with Farmers to Action, and he articulates exactly what the problem is and indeed how it can be solved, and how, although supermarkets are very keen to put forward the idea that they are supporting British farmers and that does actually make the system work. Of course, they pressure farmers into producing according simply to yield rather than nutritional value, and the intensive pressure that's put on land, of course, is detrimental to both the environment and indeed the food that's supposed to come from it, but it does yield good profits from corporations. And just to go into that in some detail, we'll look at the grocery report for the current year from Savills. And the first point to make here is that the current market value of the food and grocery market is £195 billion in the year. And just to see how that breaks down, the graph on screen now shows from the left the biggest take from the supermarkets, which is Tesco, going down to the smallest, admittedly, delivery service, which is Ocado. And in the box on the right are the two sort of other classifications, which are other outputs and independents. So it just gives a scale of, an indication of the incredible weighting towards corporate influence. But also the other thing that it brings out, which is very interesting, is to show how if one's being generous, to say that the opportunity was seized in 2020, an arrow pointing to the amount of investment in increasing the supermarket estate, so the number of enormous shops that were put up in 2020, which of course was at exactly the time when people were prohibited from engaging directly with farmers or going to smaller producers, because it was only food supermarkets that were able to continue trading. And just to reinforce the point with a sort of academic bent to it, The Lancet has published a report just yesterday called Ultra-Processed Foods and Human Health. And in the executive summary, they say that there's a rise in the rise in ultra-processed foods is driven by powerful global corporations who employ sophisticated political tactics to protect and maximize profits. And it goes on in the main editorial section to say that the ultra-processed foods industry generates enormous revenues that support the continued growth and fund corporate political activities to counter attempts at ultra-processed food regulation. A handful of manufacturers dominate the market, including Nestlé, PepsiCo, Unilever, and Coca-Cola. A comprehensive government-led approach is needed to reverse the rise in the consumption of these types of foods. Now, I think there's essentially a coherent point being made there, with the exception of the suggestion that the government may do something about it, which is why I would encourage you to listen to the interview with Alan Hughes, because he sets out this very, very important part that, frankly, the power lies with the people, who are able to make those direct transactions with farmers and to cut out the corporations and indeed the government that are ruining the system and the environment at the same time. And of course, there are to be protests next week, both on the 24th and the 26th of November. So we'll be covering that and indeed the budget as it turns out.
Vanessa, let me bring you back onto the program, and let's have a look at what Jolani has been up to.
Well, I mean, he's been doing his whistle-stop tours, of course, as we mentioned at the White House. He's been added to the anti-ISIS coalition, which effectively is going to be a recruitment drive for ISIS, with the multiple Takfiris that are under Jolani's command, basically defecting to ISIS because he's not upholding the Takfiri vision of a caliphate in the region. He's pivoting towards the West and Israel. Now, interestingly enough, this was agreed with by one of the most active kind of Israeli-based research centers or think tanks, Alma. They did an entire research paper on Syria, the threat to al-Sharaa, the dangerous scenarios for the day after, and the Israeli challenge. So the day after Ahmed al-Sharaa, because what they're saying is that now, because he's basically been added to this coalition against ISIS, and bearing in mind also that China is now pushing him to reject his Uyghur Takfiris, which is going to put him into even greater hot water with the elements of the new Syria military. So they're saying there's a very high risk to his life, primarily from the elements, including ISIS, and of course I'm just adding the Uyghur Takfiri element that he's going to return. And so basically what the paper is saying is that this will throw Syria into a terrorist vacuum situation, which might mean that ISIS and other terrorist groups might reform in the south and pose a threat to Israel. Of course, this is partially what the Western Zionist axis is trying to achieve: contain chaos within Syria that prevents any re-emergence from the coup in December 2024 or economic stability. And I would also put this in relation to Russia suddenly being allowed to go into the south, because if there is a re-emergence of ISIS, what will Russia provide? Russia will provide, alongside the US, security for Israeli expansion in the south. And I just wanted to recommend that people take a look at the Syria-centric section on UK Column, where we're bringing in journalists and analysts from the region. I say Syria-centric, but it's actually going to be covering pretty much global news related to the ongoing Zionist expansionism. And the latest is written by myself, which was published today, The Endless Spiral of Violence in Syria While Jolani is Crowned Interim Puppet Despot by Trump. This is part one, which goes into some details about the ongoing violence and ethnic cleansing massacres being committed by Jolani's forces in Syria. And the second part will look at the rise of political actors, individuals, resistance actors, individuals and groups on the ground inside Syria that may present a threat to the Western imperialist plans, but also to Jolani in the very near future.
Thank you, Vanessa. Charles, we have a bit of an and finally to end with.
We do, and it is desperately serious. But the government, through the mouthpiece of DEFRA, have just announced that new laws are in place to ban plastic wet wipes in order, they say, to protect rivers and seas. Now, this presents a significant threat to national security
and human health.
And yes, and human health indeed. But the main concern here is, of course, national security, because we only have to go back to 2018 and the statement from Public Health England in the wake of the events in Salisbury and how to clean your clothes if you've been in contact with a nerve agent. When they said wipe personal items such as phones, handbags and other electronic items with cleansing or baby wipes and dispose of the wipes in the bin, brackets, ordinary domestic waste disposal. So the situation has changed. Therefore, I have been in touch with the revamped Public Health England, which of course now exists under the banner of UK Health Security Agency. And I asked them, with both the Strategic Defence Review and the National Security Strategy predicated on the existential threat to the British public, which is posed by Russia, may I have a statement from UK HSA on the actions to be taken in the event of a nerve agent attack, now that wet wipes are banned? I'm afraid to report I have not yet had a response. I assume it's because of the level of detail they'll have to go into to satisfy all at UK Column and the UK Column audience, but I'll get back to you when I hear anything further.
Yes. Well, I'm sorry that we have to leave the programme on that grim piece of news, but
Yes.
But we do, because we are absolutely out of time. So
Yeah.
Thank you, Charles, and thank you to Vanessa for today, and thanks to everybody that's been watching. Stay on the live stream if you're a UK Column member for some UK Column news extra. And there may even be a little bit more of this kind of silliness. But anyway, we'll leave it there for now. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you in a minute. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.